Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 20, Section 1, America and the World. So follow along. Here we go. We're going to start talking a little bit about the lead up into World War II. And with your handout, we're going to talk about the rise of dictators. And one thing I want you to know is that there were quite a few dictators that were kind of coming to power, especially in Europe, but even in the Far East when we talk about Japan. So, what did the fascists believe was necessary to achieve order in a society? And they believed that it was a dictator who would lead a strong government. One of the things I would have to say about dictatorships, as repressive as they can be, it is a very efficient form of government. And many of these nations that had dictators that came to power, such as Italy or Germany or the Soviet Union or Spain, had had some kind of economic downturn as a result of the end of World War One, and people were hungry for a change. And in many cases, some of these fascist dictators were welcomed, really with open arms by the peoples of the nations that they would go on to lead, because they believed that these dictators would bring about change very quickly. Okay, not understanding the full ramifications of that. So, anyway, how did the fascists believe that nations would become great? And it was believed that the fascists believed that nations would become great through their military might and territorial expansion. So, you had a strong military that could take care of itself and maybe not only just taking care of itself, but taking care of its enemies. Um, that would lead to strength of the nation, but it would also lead to the potential growth of the nation through expanding its borders. It's still kind of going back to those ideas of imperialism in a sense. So, why did many Italians welcome Benito Mussolini's leadership? Mussolini came to power in Italy around 1919, literally in the short aftermath of World War One. And part of it was because Italy was really under a lot of change. The monarchy, for the most part, there were a lot of people questioning that. There was kind of a red scare that was happening in Italy, meaning that there were some people that thought that a communist takeover would be great. And you had people that were getting tired of riots and strikes. And here's this guy that comes along that promises stability. And for some reason, the people of Italy welcomed him, not knowing what they were going to have to give up down the line. In letter D, how did the communists establish control in the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka the USSR or Soviet Union? It happened, a lot of it with the work of Vladimir Lenin, but the communists seized control, or the Bolsheviks, if you want to call them that, and they instituted a one-party government. Okay, they suppressed liberties, and that was everything from freedom of speech to freedom of religion. And anyone who would be an opponent, they were punished. Some of them were sent to gulags, which were like prisons or concentration camps. Others were eliminated. And shortly after Vladimir Lenin comes to power, he dies. And so in 1924, Joseph Stalin takes over the Soviet Union, and he rules in a way that's far more oppressive than that of Vladimir Lenin. And certainly that had some people very concerned about the well being of that nation. What were some of the characteristics of the Nazi Party? The Nazi Party was founded again in the dying days of World War One by some of the veterans of the German army, and eventually Adolf Hitler is going to join this party, but initially he was not the founder of the party, but it was a nationalistic party. meaning that they had pride in their country. They were anti-communistic, meaning that they opposed any kind of communistic reforms. They were anti-Semitic, meaning that they were anti-Jewish. They were militaristic, meaning that they wanted a strong military, which was kind of interesting because as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to, for the most part, dismantle their military. And they were also imperialistic, in other words, wanting to establish uh, new territories. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to surrender a lot of its former colonies. And so these were all issues that the Nazi power or Nazi party championed. Adolf Hitler gained power by having Nazis elected to which part of the German government, and that part of the government, we can move this, is known as the Reichstag. The Reichstag is kind of like Congress. It is a two-house system, and this is the lower house, it would be kind of like the House of Representatives here in the United States. And this lower house of the German parliament, by the time we get to really the uh, beginning of the 1930s, the Nazi Party was the largest political party that was in the Reichstag. And in a way, this led to Adolf Hitler being voted in as chancellor in Germany around 1933, which is kind of interesting to me. Adolf Hitler was freely elected by the people of Germany. They freely voted for him. It wasn't like he came in and there was a coup d'etat or there was a revolution. He was voted in, which is kind of an unusual way to come to power compared to some of our other dictators that we've been talking about. In letter G, what did the Japanese military leaders believe was the only way for Japan to get the resources it needed? Just a reminder, kind of going back to world history, in Japan, you had kind of an imperialistic state, meaning we had an empire, an emperor that was leading the government, but there was also a parliamentary, and there was the rise of a new prime minister, which was General Tojo. So, what did they believe was going to help them out? Seizing territories from other nations, particularly the nations in their neighborhood. Um, Korea, for the most part, was occupied by the Japanese military. Eventually, we had the takeover of Manchuria. And eventually, in the 1930s, you're going to see parts of China that are going to fall to the Japanese military. All right, moving onwards. We're going to talk about American neutrality. There were some people after World War One that really thought that our nation needed to kind of mind its own business. And as a result of the the Roaring Twenties and economic gains, a lot of people thought that war was something that was in our past. We didn't have to worry about that again. But with the rise of these dictators, there was a lot of concerns about possibly having to go back and fighting another war. So, in letter A, why were Americans discouraged about the rise of dictatorships in Europe and Asia? And the reason why a lot of Americans were concerned about that is they thought that these dictators that were coming to power made all the sacrifices of World War One seem pointless. It was known that World War One was going to be the war to end all wars, and as the 30s kind of keep rolling on, we're finding that that might not be true. So members of Congress decided that they needed to investigate some of this, and they designed what is known as the Nye Committee. The Nye Committee was established by a man named Senator Gerald Nye. He was a Republican from the state of North Dakota. And one of the things that they wanted to investigate were some of the allegations that the weapons manufacturers or arms manufacturers had kind of tricked the United States into entering World War One. Okay, so the Nye Committee had a series of hearings, and what they basically discovered was that these arms manufacturers, these factories, made huge profits as a result of the First World War. This committee, for the most part, documented the huge profits that were made, and they made a report. And the report basically led a lot of people to the impression that big business had influenced the decision for our nation to go to war. What ends up happening as a result of the publication of these findings, a lot of people in the United States became more isolationist, more adamant that we should kind of stay out of the war. And there were a couple of reasons why that probably was happening. One, we were in the middle of the Great Depression. A lot of people thought that we needed to take care of our own issues at home, our own domestic affairs. And the other was the fact that when we talk about like the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations and all the loans that our nation had lended to European nations, by the time we get to about 1934, most of the nations, with the exception of Finland, pretty much told the United States that they were not going to pay back any of the debt. And that in itself made some people really upset, and rightly so. So, one of the things that our Congress is going to come up with is this idea of establishing what we call a Neutrality Act. Neutrality Act, for the most part, would be a piece of legislation that basically would help keep the United States out of the war. And there were three different acts that your book talks about. Granted, there were others that are going to come later. But each one of these acts really didn't have a long lifespan. Matter of fact, the first one that we're going to look at, the Neutrality Act of 1935, only really lasted 6 months. And with each year, a new act had to be passed through Congress. So in the first of these, the Neutrality Act of 1935, what our government basically established was that there was going to be a mandatory embargo on the selling or exporting of arms. So we're not going to sell and we're not going to ship out any weapons. Ammunition would be included, and any kind of implements of war to nations that are at war. And that's the key. If a country is already at war, and so when we look at maybe our history books, we would probably be looking at like Japan, for example. We weren't going to send them any weapons. It also restricted travel to these countries. So if you were an American and you wanted to travel to Japan, you might not be able to do that. Okay. After a period of time, we passed a new Neutrality Act in 1936. Basically, it was kind of the same old, same old. Still having an arms embargo with the countries at war, travel restrictions. There was a ban on loans to nations that were fighting, but we would basically lend them money on basically a short term. So, like, they needed to borrow money for 6 months, we would probably do that. But otherwise, we weren't going to lend them money for any kind of debt that was going to be paid over a long period of time. In 1937, we also passed another act. This basically, again, established the arms embargo against nations at war. There was a travel ban on warring nation ships, meaning that if you were a nation at war, your ships could not come into American harbors. There was also basically a restriction on trade, and we would trade with nations that were at war on what we call a cash and carry basis, meaning that they had to pay for whatever goods that they were trying to buy with money up front. Okay. And those goods, for the most part, could not be contraband, meaning that they couldn't be munitions for the most part, or sent on foreign ships. So, in other words, you have to pay cash and you have to carry it out. That's kind of the goal. And that's going to become the gospel for a while until we get into the actual war. Okay. Now, I want to talk about pretty famous isolationist. A while back we had some presentations, and one of them had a little bit to do with this guy named Charles Lindbergh, who, if you look at this cartoon, and by the way, if you look down in the corner, you might see who our cartoonist is, though I think if you look at the picture, you might be familiar with some of the artwork. Our good friend Dr. Seuss. Okay, before Dr. Seuss started writing things like Green Eggs and Ham, he actually was a political cartoonist. And what's interesting is a lot of those caricatures that he would draw and use in his books in the future look very similar to some of these characters that you might see in his political cartoons. But he's got Lindbergh, and Lindbergh is an isolationist. He was a very vocal isolationist at that. And he criticized Roosevelt. "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." And here he is patting the head of this beast with all these swastikas. In other words, you probably pretty much could say that Dr. Seuss obviously thought that Lindbergh was full of it, and he didn't realize how dangerous maybe the Nazis were. So, after the passage of the Neutrality Act in 1937, how could warring nations buy non military goods from the U.S.? If you paid attention a little bit ago, those warring nations could buy non military goods with a cash and carry basis. Letter D. What is the name for the idea that trade between nations creates prosperity and helps prevent war? It's called internationalism. And I have to say that we kind of live in that kind of world today. If you want to keep peace, you trade. Okay. Letter E. What was Roosevelt's reason for authorizing the sale of arms to the nation of China? You got to remember, China was in the crosshairs of Japan. But FDR thought that since China and Japan had not declared war, the Neutrality Act of 1937 really didn't apply. In other words, he's looking at the technicalities here. All right. Thank you very much.